Let's take a look at a real example first. This is the ASP.NET membership provider that ships with ASP.NET 2.0. So the base type here is membership provider, which is defined in system.web.security.membership-provider. And this is what's used out of the box for things like the SQL membership provider that many websites are built on today, and allow you to leverage the login controls and forgot password control and other things out of the box with ASP.NET 2.0 or later. One of the common criticisms of the membership provider, though, is that it has a very fat interface. In fact, it has quite a large interface. If we look at this very, very simple implementation of the membership provider, where we have not yet implemented anything at all, you can see that just to fill out this set of non-implemented exceptions for each method or property is over 100 lines of code. Now, if we look at some of the classes that utilize this interface, this membership provider type, we can consider the login control from, again, the ASP.NET world. And here we have the system.web.ui.login control. And specifically, we want to look at this method here. So we have a method that's aptly named authenticate using membership provider. And this calls a little utility called loginutil.getProvider, which fetches the current membership provider. And that method is shown here. You can see it's not doing anything too special. It's just grabbing whatever the currently configured provider might be. And then the part that we're interested in is right here. Once it's gotten a membership provider, this type here that's returned by this static method, the method that it calls is validate user. Now, if we look at all the rest of this class, we will find that this is, in fact, the only reference to the membership provider that the login control has, which makes sense because obviously the login control is a very cohesive control. It's very tightly focused. It has a single responsibility pretty much of validating the user. And so it would make sense that it would only need to call this one method, and that it would only need to be concerned with passing that method the two things that it requires, which are, of course, the username and the password. But if we want to leverage the login control in our ASP.NET website, and we want to do so with our own custom membership provider that talks to something other than SQL, or we write our own version of the SQL membership provider, or we talk to Oracle, or we talk to Facebook, whatever, we're going to have to implement the membership provider interface, because the login control depends on membership provider and not on, for example, an iValidate user interface that would be specific to what it actually needs. Now, moving away from this example of the ASP.NET membership, because it would be rather time-consuming to actually work with this large interface, we're going to work with another example that's still very practical. In many of my applications, I use a configuration section in order to define some of the common settings. I think most developers in .NET do this as well. If we look at a very simple implementation called About Page that you could imagine might exist in an ASP.NET application with some modification, of course, you can see that it's taking in a text writer, and then it's going to basically write out the current application name and who wrote it, the author name. Now, it's not going to hard code these things. It's going to do this in such a way that it's reusable and configurable. And so it's going to use this configuration settings class in order to achieve this. Now, of course, this application does a lot of things. So this configuration settings class has grown somewhat large over the course of time of building this application. Let's have a look at that class. So the configuration settings class inherits from configuration section, which means that we can use it to read from the web config or app config file of our application. It has some boilerplate code in here whereby it exposes a static settings property, which is of its own type, and when called, will go ahead and give you a loaded up version of this setting. We also take advantage of some nice features with the attributes here, where we can specify that some of these configuration settings are required, and these will actually be enforced at runtime when someone attempts to retrieve one of these properties. The actual implementation of all this is beyond the scope of a talk on the interface segregation principle, but if you are using .NET, it's worth learning how this stuff works with the configuration property. So if we look at a summary of these types, we'll see that we've got an application name, an author name, a cache duration, database server name, database username, database password, and a web service base URI. These are all the things that represent my settings for my application. The way this has been implemented, it also is using a configuration file. So you can see that I've defined my new section here called configuration settings. And then I have all of those settings specified here with their default configuration. Now with this in place, everything actually works. I can go into my About Page tester called About Page Should, and I can say About Page should display the application name. And if I run this, we should get a green light, and we do. So what this is basically saying is that I expect to get interface segregation by Steve Smith as my output when I call aboutpage.render, and I don't pass it in anything. So we have a default constructor, but we have a note here that says this is hard to test. We have to have an app config in order to test this. If I go and I take my app config and I remove it, or I change the name of anything in here, so I change my name to Steve Smith 2, and then I want to rerun my tests, we find that this is going to be very brittle, because now we're going to see that it failed. Steve Smith was expected, but we actually got Steve Smith 2. So the problem with this is that when you start relying on these configuration files throughout your code, two things happen. One, you've got a dependency on a file, which means your unit tests are much more brittle and more difficult for multiple different users to have working correctly on their own machines. And the other issue is that now we've got a bunch of stuff that we had to set even though we didn't need it. So for instance, in order to do all this testing of the About page, I had to go into app config and I had to also put in settings for cache duration, database server name, and all this other stuff that I really don't care about at all for this test or for that class. But if I go look at configuration settings, I'm going to find that those things are all required. So if I didn't set them, I would be getting an exception at the time when I went to test it. And we can show that real quick as well if we just delete one of these and then change my name back to Steve Smith, run our test one more time. You can see that now we're getting another error that says that we threw an exception, and if we look at that exception, we'll see that it's telling us that the required attribute cache duration was not found. So again, because of our dependency on this fat interface of configuration settings, we are now getting hosed by these dependencies on things that we really don't care about. Let's go analyze what some of the problems are with this.